hope you're doing well. I'm very excited to film this video because it's something I have been thinking about for a little while, and I just wanted to bring out the playfulness and the fun elements of watercolor. And how do we do that? How do we take watercolor from something that is lovely and smooth and beautiful to something a little bit more fun and out there and something that grabs attention? So let's think about 4 main techniques which I want to show you today. So focusing on bold effects in watercolor, we're going to talk about color pop. So I'm going to show you color combination that you can think about your favorite colors and work it accordingly. I'm going to show you my favorite color combo and how to make those 2 colors pop. Then we will experiment a little bit with the metallic effects, so how to use metallic watercolor or with regular watercolor. Value contrast, so here we will think about how to play with different values, which is going from the lightest to the darkest, and how to use them effectively. And also interesting textures, so this is when granulation will come into play as well. Okay, so mainly this will be all watercolor, but I also want to then afterwards, when everything is completely dry, I want to show you a couple of things that you can implement into your watercolors and make it a little bit more mixed media. So for those of you who are strictly watercolor lovers, you can, stay at that stage, and then stage 2 will be adding a few effects here and there and just making it maybe even more playful. But see how you feel, see what your comfort zone is, whether you're ready to experiment further outside of just the watercolor boundaries or whether you are comfortable with staying with watercolor. Let's start with color pop. So for my favorite color, I'm going to go into a beautiful teal. By the way, the watercolors I will be using today predominantly are Roman Schmal, and this is their Aquarius range. Also, you may find that I will be adding a couple more maybe brands here and there, but all of these pans are Aquarius. So what I want to show you here is that if you, for example, want to create a main piece, or like the main color, you want it to be this lovely turquoise. A color that would pop beautifully is something like a gorgeous yellow. So that yellow makes the 2 colors play together nicely. Obviously, where they will touch, they will create a green. So, but they are a beautiful combo. You may find that you might want to go a bit more orange. And let's take this color here. So this is also a lovely color to pop. Sometimes when you are mixing 2 colors that are opposite on the color wheel, let's take the blue-green being our turquoise. The opposite color is the orange. So anything here will work as well. So we added this color here, which is sort of in between yellow, orange and orange. It still will do nicely. However, right opposite is a red orange. So those colors are opposite, meaning that they are a beautiful combination color-wise. However, when you mix them, they will create mud. So what I mean by that, if I take a little tray and demonstrate a mixture, here is our turquoise and here is our orange, and bring the 2 together, this is the color we get. Now we can of course play together with those 2 colors and push it one direction or another to create a more pleasant version. So that's possible, but just remember, if you do 50-50 ratio, usually you get some sort of a not very pleasant color. So the best thing to do would be to wait until one color is dried completely. So say, I'll just give you an example right here. And then you can add the other colors on top. So this will be the mixed media edition once everything dries. Now let's move to metallic effect. With metallic effect, same thing, you can do both techniques. You can do wet on wet, which was this, or you can do the wet on dry, which will be this. So let me show you both. For example, I'm going to go into this color here, which I think is the Payne's Grey, I think. So for example, we have a lovely little wash here. And then, as it is still wet, I'm going to think about this rose gold. I think that's a good color. So with metallics, you actually have to let a little drop of water sit there, just so it kind of wakes up the colors. Not for too long, usually just maybe 10 seconds is enough. And a really saturated mixture with loads of pigment. You're going to just kind of add into some of these areas. Like that. So here it was a thinner mix, so less water, and therefore it dried slightly faster than the side here. So you'll see two different effects, but I will also show you what happens when you do wet on dry. So for that, I'm going to create another swatch right here, and we're going into it when it's completely dry. So now let's think about the value contrast. So here usually I would advise to take a color that would go to a very, very dark spectrum and then to a light one. So here we have like a medium value. I wouldn't advise using this color for value contrast, although if you wanted, you could. It just isn't too dark enough. So if you wanted to get this highest contrast effect, go for something that's really, really intense. So here I've got Sodalite Genuine by Daniel Smith, and it does go super, super dark, similar to a Payne's Grey, where it almost can be seen as black. So you can see here a very thick mixture, not too much water, because we're interested first of all in a very, very dark saturated swatch. And then what you can do with that is you can play and you can create a very light mix of the same color, and you can see side by side they really are playing. So let's introduce the two colors together. So that's your contrast. I can also add the same color at the bottom and let them flow into each other and have a little bit of fun. I can also show you, similarly like we've done with the previous examples, a wet on dry. So I'm just going to create a light swatch to begin with. Interesting texture. Now that is, let's take Lunar Black. So Lunar Black is a super, super granulating color, and I'm going to mix two colors here. So the other one is, I think, Roman Schmaltz Aquarius Brown, I think it is. So it's really, really beautiful. And when you mix the two together, you should get some interesting effects here. So you can see the immediate granulation. I can also do them mix on top of each other, mix together. And what you do with those interesting textures, generally you add a bit of like movement, just so they kind of start playing and granulating even further. So with the interesting textures, you can't really do that much of a different effect with wet on dry, because you do need that water and you need the two colors to actually play together and have fun. So this wouldn't be a great example for other things, but I'm just going to introduce also non-granulating colors just to make you see how that could work as well. So if you wanted to, you could mix granulating with non-granulating, but obviously two granulating colors are going to create more fun and more play. I'll also take some, let's see, I'll go with this color here, some green. So if you're working with some landscapes, for example, you could create loads of lovely textures. Okay, so I'm going to wait for all of this to dry, and then we're going to go back ahead and I'm going to show you the wet on dry as well as the mixed media effect. Another technique I want to show you is a lifting technique, and you can do it both with a brush and also with a napkin or tissue. Oftentimes it's a kind of like a happy discovery for artists, because when we don't have that much time for waiting for a little puddle of water to dry, or maybe you feel like the paper that you're using is thinner than it should be and you don't want the paper to disintegrate while you're waiting for this puddle to dry, you can just lift it with a napkin or like a little tissue or a rug if you have, and then you're going to get this lovely effect, which is again a great one for things like abstract art, or even in some cases, you know, if you want to create extra texture for landscapes, this is all a lot of fun. So you can just go ahead and sort of, you know, maybe even use a little sponge to create extra texture on top of that. I'll show you a little sponge you can use. So this sponge can be used dry or wet. So you could, for example, dip it into a nice little mix you've done with watercolor, and then just go ahead and add a bit of that mossy texture. Or you could, for example, try and lift with this sponge like so, and then if you go somewhere else, for example, there you go, just move it around so it's not exactly the same, and you get a moss texture very, very quickly. These can be purchased, you know, in art shops, and they are very, very much fun to use. It's a natural sponge from the sea. So there you go. And I purchased mine on Jackson's. I'll leave a link below. I'm going to do the same here actually and just show you. You can dab it, you can smudge it, you can do all sorts of fun things like that. Let's go back to the color pop technique, and what we're going to do here, by the way, if you're new, I have a class where I teach about contemporary color palettes, how to play with your colors effectively, and all about color pop. So I will link it up here somewhere for you if you're interested. But what we're doing here is called glazing in botanical art. So what you're doing is just adding a layer of another color. It could be the same color, but oftentimes it's another color on top of something that's already dry. And if the color that you're adding is not opaque, if it's transparent or semi-transparent, it's going to look slightly different to when it is on the white paper. Meaning that you have to consider that if you want to keep that exact pure color here. Because watercolors tend to be transparent most times, you can then introduce your other mediums to the full effect of being completely opaque. So if I go into my pencils and pick out some orange colors, so this is, what is this one? Carnelian. And you can see that even in this case, the pencil is more orange on the paper than it is there. So what you would need for full opacity is something like an acrylic marker. Here I have orange and I have Dare orange. So this is Molotov, this is Posca. Always shake them up before using. If you don't, you might find that your acrylic marker is just going to be kind of watery, which is exactly what you don't want. I presume if you are planning to use your acrylic marker, you're probably seeking opacity. And there you go. It's popping straight away. You can see it's the best way to pop. I'll show you close-ups in a minute. I'm also going to show you the orange. For smaller details, you might want to consider smaller nibs, and then if you want like more impact, maybe larger nibs are better. There you go. So I could take that somewhere here, for example, or I could even make larger marks. I'm also going to show it to you on the paper. They are a lot of fun to introduce with watercolors. Another thing I want to show you is a really fun tool, which are the Neocolor 2. There's also Neocolor 1, which you would use first and then go over with watercolor. Actually, I can show you that. So let me show you in this example here. I'm going to just scribble a little bit of Neocolor 1, which is a waxy crayon. And now I'm going to show you in the orange color. Let's see, this is a good one. So this is the vermilion. I'm going to show you that on top of dry. And I'm also actually going to show you on top of wet. So I'm going to wet this watercolor or create a nice new swatch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scribble and then go through the wet just to show you what we can get here, the effects. And then I'm going to go into the dry and show you that you can create a lovely little wash. The watercolor beneath will obviously also wake up from any new layer of wetness introduced to it, because it is activated by water. So you can do loads of different things. I'm also going to show you actually just with a clear bit of paper water, just to demonstrate how lovely it can be if you're using and pulling your dry crayon. And look, once it gets wet, it gets quite sort of intensified, and you can really quickly create larger areas. So let me show you a close-up. So look how much fun we had creating all these textures. And think about your favorite color palette. I mean, obviously you can take any color combo that speaks to you, and you can then, you know, translate it into your own art and translate it into your own paintings. Just study the color wheel. So here you can see that the most opaque colors are these from the markers. They hardly change as you go from the paper to the color. Just make sure you really give them a good shake before using, so that they're at the most opaque stage. So let's come back quickly to the color wheel for your color combo inspo. So think about, what's your favorite color? Could it be a blue, for example? Then study what is opposite blue. It's like orange that's between a yellow and between a red orange. So then you can create similar art with that. You can also take it further. It doesn't have to be exact same color variations. It could be slightly different orange colors, more yellow, more red orange. It doesn't have to be that strict. You can go anywhere here and just play around with it. Yellow green, for example, looks good with red violet or violet. I don't strictly follow the rules, because for me personally there's some color combinations I absolutely cannot stand, and I would sort of play around to create my own. So just kind of listen to your gut and go with that. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm going to add that Payne's Grey on top of this Neo color too, and look what happens. It stays untouched. Another thing you could do, really have a lot of fun, the darker you go, the more it pops. So this technique could be applied to the value contrast really well, because as more contrast you're creating, the more a certain color will pop. And because it's water resistant, being wax, you can get some interesting effects there. So now let's see what happens if we add exactly the same color on top. So we're still staying within the watercolor region. I'm going to just load my brush, and you can see I'm going to go on paper and on top of watercolor, and it's fairly opaque. Just make sure you're not doing something like this, because it will wake up the color underneath, and then your metallic might be less popping, it might be less effective, as it will start blending with the color that was originally painted. So again, I'll show you an example of that, where I just wiggled my brush. If you can see, it's kind of blended in, and then those that I haven't blended. So at this point, another great thing to do is also introduce a metallic. So I have a metallic from the, so I've got a Neo Color 1, so similar like this. It can go on top, it can go underneath, so you could do the same thing as we've done before. Let's in fact do it here. So I'm going to apply the one first, and we're going to go over with the Payne's Grey, and I'm just going to show you a bit more here on the dry. Or you could go with a Neo Color 2. Their gold is slightly different, it's more like a olive green, but it's beautiful left dry, as well as, I'll show you some area here, blending with water. So let's just use a bit of water, and we're going to blend through. So it's not going to be as strong once you introduce the water to it, but it might add an extra effect. Let's go back into Payne's Grey and add it onto here. So you can see it's water resistant. No matter how much water you add, it will still resist it. So that's another great effect for you. Of course, this is a great time to introduce your metallic acrylic markers. We have got gold and a bronze, both by Posca. With metallics, super important to give them a good mix beforehand, otherwise they can look a little bit watery. And you can see that we are getting the full impact here. I love the rose gold with Payne's Grey, just so pretty. I'm going to go in on top of the watercolor as well. Again, contrast wise, it's great to go over very dark areas. And let me show you this effect. So we have got loads and loads going on here, from the dry textures to the wet textures. Here a slightly softer effect with the still metallic in the dark of the Payne's Grey. Here more definition, and then of course just completely opaque is right here. And then we have different mediums, and these, like I said, the Neo Color 1 and 2, they are slightly like satin in texture. They're not very metallic like your acrylic markers here and there, which you can see have a beautiful effect. And then of course the Neo Color 1, if you layer that first and go with the watercolor on top, then you'll have that perfect definition where you can create loads of lovely effects. As well as here, it almost looks crisper than if you would do that, like the Neo Color 1 on top of the watercolor. It just looks super crisp. When playing with value contrast, you are going to go from one spectrum to the other spectrum. You can mix the colors, you can create a very dark and intense mix of one color and then a very, very light of another. And it just doesn't have to be just one color, it can be loads of different things. But then think about adding, again, contrasting mediums. So this is white. If I'm going to go on paper white, it's not going to do anything. But this is a watercolor pencil. I find that watercolor pencils are great because, again, you can dissolve them, you can create a softer look, which I will show you here. And then this one is Soft White by Holbein, and what this does is, like, it's supposed to be the most opaque pencil to go over anything, and it's got that slightly oily texture to it, but you can see it's so much more opaque and it stays as it is. So let me just show you with a little bit of water here, so you can melt it and create like a hazy effect. For example, that would be great for snow. And then, of course, always going back to acrylic markers for full intensity. This particular color is Nature White. And you can see that is the most opaque. So that's that. Then I also wanted to show you what happens if we add, for example, like a contrasting swatch on top, or if we just actually switch to a fine brush of the same color, and we can just create the opposite effect where we're going dark dots or dark marks over light. By the way, I am in the process of editing my newest and latest class, which will have a lot of these kind of doodling and mark making fun exercises and lessons. So if you're interested, stay tuned. Hopefully it will be available like next week, I'm hoping, but we'll see. So again, you can just, carry on with these marks, and using a brush, it will never be perfect because then the brush gets a bit dry. If it's small, you're not controlling the water. You need to constantly go and dip into that, and so it creates kind of like a more versatile and more organic mark making effect. So the dots will always be slightly different to when you're using a nib where you have more control. Finally, when it comes to textures, now here you can go into all of the above. So you could bring in some contrasting colors, you can bring some metallic or value play. So I could do at this point anything I wanted. So I'm going to go into the gold Posca pen and just add a few marks. Because it's so heavily textured from the watercolor, it's not going to be as obvious as you use it on the smoother paints. So keep that in mind. However, of course, you can do loads of different things. You could dot for like extra texture. That is also a fun little texture. If you really create small, tiny little dots where they become part of the texture rather than mark making, so they're not too obvious unless you look very closely at them. That's another fun way of perhaps enhancing texture as well as adding some beautiful effects of like metallic paint, where perhaps when looking straight ahead you wouldn't notice it like now, but if I tilt it, and then you can see the reflection right there. Hopefully I'll show you a nice close-up of that as well. You could add some of your other mediums. For example, here right at the edge, I'm sort of going to play with that because it's kind of blending in again. rather than about mark making. However, it's creating a lovely transition from one color into another and a little textural effect. I'm going to do that here, which is more visible, and then you can also see the effects of this. Again, depending what sort of mark making you go for, if you sharpen the tip even further and you get really tiny dots, you could get away with more textural effects. And then, of course, this color here, also more for blending in. I just love dots, but you know, you can be as creative as you wish and think about all sorts of different mark makings that come to mind. So now let's have a look. So see, when I bring it up close, like from here somewhere, you think it's all part of the paint. But when you start looking a bit closer, especially with a little bit of reflection, you then get these lovely metallic effects. So I hope you found this quite insightful and super inspiring, and you can go to your favorite sketchbooks, your favorite colors, pick out some of the mediums that you haven't perhaps tried, and yeah, explore, experiment, and be as creative as you can be. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.